Stop this sham marriage. This man is our father. Our mother isn't dead. She's alive and in a coma. Hello, my precious and deeply respected family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Every day I carry your kindness in my heart. You are not just an audience. You are the honor behind my voice, the dignity in every story. Knowing you're here gives my work its soul. Sometimes I wonder, do you still feel the bond we promised each other? Not for views, but for the love that first knit us together. If your heart still remembers, please write in the comments. I still believe in you. Those 5 words whisper that our circle is unbroken, our respect unchanged. Now, please receive this prayer. Offered with all the gentleness and reverence you deserve, may serenity rise over your life like dawn over quiet waters. May your steps be guided by wisdom, your hands by kindness, and your dreams by courage. May every burden grow lighter, every joy grow brighter, and may grace honor your name wherever it is spoken. May your home be a safe harbor, and may the peace you share return to you 100-fold. This space is more than content. It is a refuge of respect and love, and always, always, I still believe in you. The late afternoon sun streamed through the towering stained glass windows of St. Catherine's Cathedral, casting rainbow prisms across the marble floor where Kyle Barrett stood in his perfectly pressed black tuxedo. 200 guests filled the ornate pews, their faces glowing with anticipation as organ music swelled through the sacred space. Kyle's bride, Jennifer Whitmore, looked radiant in her designer gown, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon beneath her grandmother's pearl tiara. Kyle should have felt like the luckiest man alive. Instead, his stomach churned with a familiar guilt that had gnawed at him for 3 years, ever since he'd made the decision that would define him as either a survivor or a coward. He glanced toward the front pew where his 10-year-old twins, Joshua and Robin, sat in their matching navy suits, their faces solemn and unreadable. The boys had been unusually quiet during the morning preparations. Joshua, the older twin by 12 minutes, had barely spoken while Kyle helped him with his dear. Robin, typically the more emotional and talkative of the two, had spent most of the morning staring out their hotel window at the bustling streets of Millbrook, a city 200 miles from their old life in Riverside, where everything had changed forever. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Matthews, his voice echoing through the cathedral, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Kyle Michael Barrett and Jennifer Ann Whitmore in holy matrimony." Kyle's hands trembled slightly as he took Jennifer's perfectly manicured fingers in his. She smiled up at him with such trust, such complete faith in the man she believed him to be. If only she knew the truth about the Friday evening drives he claimed were business trips to check on old projects. If only she knew about the GPS coordinates saved in his phone for Greenwood Care Center. If only she knew about the woman who lay motionless in room 247, breathing through machines while Kyle whispered apologies and read her favorite poetry. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," the Reverend continued, "but with careful consideration and complete honesty between partners." The word honesty hit Kyle like a physical blow. He forced himself to maintain eye contact with Jennifer, even as shame threatened to consume him. Behind her, he could see Jennifer's father, District Attorney Robert Whitmore, and her mother, Judge Patricia Whitmore, 2 of the most powerful legal minds in the state. They had welcomed Kyle into their family based on his story of being a widowed architect, a devoted father raising twin boys after losing his beloved wife Kathy in a tragic car accident 3 years ago. Every detail of Kyle's fabricated grief had been carefully crafted. He'd shown them photos of Kathy, young, beautiful, vibrant Kathy, with her warm brown eyes and infectious laugh. He'd spoken of her with just the right mixture of sadness and healing acceptance. He'd even taken Jennifer to a cemetery where he claimed Kathy was buried, standing over an unmarked plot while manufacturing tears that felt real because the pain was real, just not for the reasons Jennifer believed. If anyone here knows of any reason why Kyle and Jennifer should not be wed, Reverend Matthews announced, his words carrying across the hushed cathedral, "Speak now or forever, hold your peace." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Kyle held his breath as he always did during this part of any wedding he'd attended since his deception began. It was an antiquated tradition, he told himself. No one ever actually spoke up during this part. No one ever... Stop! The single word shattered the sacred silence like a gunshot. Kyle's blood turned to ice as he recognized the voice, young, clear, and devastatingly familiar. He turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, to see Joshua standing in the front pew. The 10-year-old boy's face was pale but determined, his green eyes, so much like his mother's, blazing with a courage that Kyle had never possessed. "Joshua, sit down," Kyle whispered desperately, but his voice cracked and carried further than intended. Robin stood up beside his brother, his smaller frame trembling, but his resolve matching Joshua's. In his hands, he clutched something that made Kyle's vision blur with panic, a manila envelope thick with papers. "Daddy can't marry Miss Jennifer," Joshua announced, his young voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics. Every head turned toward the twins, and Kyle could hear the collective intake of breath from 200 shocked guests. "Boys, please," Kyle started, taking a step toward them, but Joshua held up his hand with an authority that seemed impossible. "For a child. Our mama didn't die," Robin said, his voice smaller than his brother's, but no less clear. "Daddy lied to everyone." Jennifer's bouquet of white roses and baby's breath fell from her nerveless fingers, scattering petals across the marble steps. "What are they talking about, Kyle?" she demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that echoed off the cathedral walls. Joshua reached into the envelope Robin held and pulled out a stack of papers, medical bills, GPS printouts, and photographs that Kyle recognized with growing horror. "Our mama is alive," Joshua said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She's sleeping in Greenwood Care Center, and Daddy visits her every weekend. He told us not to tell anyone because it would make people sad, but we found all the papers." The cathedral erupted in chaos. Guests began murmuring frantically among themselves, some standing to get a better view of the drama unfolding at the altar. Jennifer's mother, Judge Patricia Whitmore, rose from her seat with the commanding presence that had made her legendary in the courtroom. "Kyle," Jennifer's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "Tell me they're confused. Tell me this is some kind of mistake." Kyle opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain 3 years of carefully constructed lies? How could he make anyone understand the suffocating weight of visiting? A wife who couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't give him any sign that she knew he was there. How could he describe the loneliness of loving someone who was present but absent, alive but unreachable? Robin stepped forward, his little hand shaking, as he held up a photograph. "This is Mama," he said, tears beginning to stream down his freckled cheeks. "She's beautiful and she's sleeping, but she's not dead. Daddy reads to her every weekend and tells her about us, but then he comes home and pretends she's in heaven." The photograph was one Kyle kept hidden in his wallet, Kathy in her hospital bed, peaceful but pale, surrounded by machines that monitored her vital signs and helped her breathe. Her auburn hair was spread across the pillow, and though her eyes were closed, she looked as beautiful as the day Kyle had first fallen in love with her 15 years ago. Jennifer snatched the photograph from Robin's trembling hands, her face going white as she stared at the evidence of Kyle's deception. She's really alive." Jennifer's voice broke on the last word. "Yes," Joshua said firmly. "Daddy pays for her special care and visits every Friday after work. He has a card to get into the building and everything. We followed him once when we were supposed to be at a soccer practice. District Attorney Robert Whitmore was already on his phone, presumably calling his office. His face was a mask of professional fury that promised legal consequences Kyle hadn't even begun to consider. Judge Patricia Whitmore approached the altar with the measured steps of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing verdicts. "Kyle Barrett," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of her judicial authority. "If what these children are saying is true, you have committed fraud on multiple levels. Marriage licenses, insurance documents, legal affidavits, all of it based on the lie that your wife is deceased." Kyle found his voice at last, but it came out as a broken whisper. "I can explain—" "No," Jennifer cut him off, backing away from him as if he were contaminated. Don't say another word." She turned to the twins, her eyes filling with tears. "Boys, I am so sorry. I am so sorry that you had to carry this secret." Joshua wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "We didn't want to hurt you, Miss Jennifer. We like you. But we couldn't let Daddy forget Mama completely, and we couldn't let him lie anymore. It was making us sick inside." Robin nodded emphatically. "We love Daddy, but lying is wrong, and Mama is still our Mama, even if she can't wake up to take care of us." The Reverend, clearly out of his depth, cleared his throat nervously. "I think perhaps we should postpone this ceremony until these matters can be resolved." Jennifer laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. "Postpone? Reverend, there isn't going to be a wedding. Ever." She turned back to Kyle, her blue eyes blazing, with a fury that was somehow more devastating than screaming would have been. "You let me plan a future with you. You let me fall in love with you. You let me love your children. And all of it, every single moment, was built on a lie." She stripped the engagement ring from her finger and threw it at Kyle's feet, where it clattered across the marble and came to rest near the scattered rose petals. "I hope she wakes up, Kyle. I hope your wife wakes up and sees exactly what kind of man she married." Jennifer turned and walked down the aisle with her head held high, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a banner of wounded dignity. Her parents followed, but not before District Attorney Whitmore paused beside Kyle. "My office will be in touch," he said quietly. "What you've done here goes far beyond a simple lie, Mr. Barrett. You've defrauded multiple institutions and individuals. I suggest you get yourself an attorney." As the cathedral emptied amid whispers and stares, Kyle found himself alone at the altar with his two sons. Joshua and Robin approached him slowly, their faces reflecting a mixture of love, guilt, and determination that broke Kyle's heart into pieces. "Daddy," Robin whispered, "are you mad at us?" Kyle knelt down and pulled both boys into his arms, burying his face in their hair as he fought back tears. "No, baby, I'm not mad. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you had to be the ones to tell the truth, because I was too much of a coward to do it myself." Joshua pulled back to look at his father. "Daddy, we want to go see Mama. We want to tell her we're sorry we kept the secret for so long." Kyle nodded, knowing that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. But for the first time in 3 years, the weight of deception was lifting from his shoulders. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's go see your Mama." As they walked down the aisle of the empty cathedral, Kyle realized that his 10-year-old sons had more courage and integrity than he'd shown in 3 years of lies. The truth was finally out, and whatever consequences awaited him, at least his boys would no longer have to carry the burden of his deception. The afternoon sun still streamed through the stained glass windows, but now it illuminated the wreckage of Kyle's lies and the beginning of whatever truth would follow. Chapter 2. The Reckoning. The law offices of Whitmore and Associates occupied 3 floors of Millbrook's most prestigious downtown building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city below. Kyle Barrett sat in the leather chair across from District Attorney Robert Whitmore's mahogany desk, his hands clenched in his lap as he faced the full fury of a man whose daughter had been publicly humiliated and deceived. "Marriage fraud," District Attorney Whitmore said, his voice carrying the cold precision of a prosecutor building a case. "Document fraud, tax evasion, child endangerment for forcing those boys to carry your lies." He slid a thick folder across the desk. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Barrett. My investigators have been busy." 3 days had passed since the wedding disaster, and Kyle's world had collapsed faster than he'd thought possible. The boys were staying with Kathy's sister, Emma Acton, who had flown in from Denver the moment she'd seen the news coverage. Emma, a successful pediatric surgeon, had immediately petitioned for emergency custody of Joshua and Robin, citing Kyle's pattern of systematic deception and emotional manipulation of minors. Kyle opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were copies of marriage license applications where he'd falsely declared himself a widower, tax returns filed as head of household claiming survivor benefits while simultaneously paying medical bills for his living wife, bank records showing weekend expenditures that corresponded exactly with his visits to Greenwood Care Center, GPS data from his phone tracking his movements to the facility every Friday for 3 years. "You haven't been collecting life insurance benefits," Whitmore continued, "because you're smarter than that. But you have been claiming tax deductions for medical expenses for a deceased spouse while filing as a single father. You've been receiving sympathy donations from colleagues who believed your wife was dead. You've defrauded my daughter and her family by obtaining a marriage license under false pretenses." Kyle's attorney, Harold Morrison, a public defender who looked barely older than Kyle himself, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Mr. Whitmore, my client is obviously remorseful about his actions. Perhaps we could discuss a plea arrangement." "Remorseful?" Whitmore's laugh was harsh. "Your client isn't remorseful, counselor. He's sorry he got caught. There's a significant difference." He pulled out another document. "This is a statement from Dr. Sarah Chen at Greenwood Care Center. She confirms that your client has been visiting patient Catherine Acton every weekend for 3 years, paying all her bills and making medical decisions as her legal husband, all while telling the world she was dead." Kyle found his voice at last, though it came out as a broken whisper. "I never stopped loving her. I never stopped taking care of her." "But you stopped being honest about it," Whitmore replied sharply. "You turned your wife's tragedy into a convenient fiction. You used her condition to gain sympathy from women you wanted to date. You taught your children to participate in deception, and when one of those relationships progressed to marriage, you were prepared to become a bigamist rather than tell the truth." The worst part was that Whitmore was right. Kyle had crafted his story carefully over the years: the grieving widower, the devoted single father, the man who'd lost the love of his life but was bravely moving forward. It had worked perfectly with Jennifer, who'd been drawn to his apparent depth and sensitivity. She'd admired how he spoke of Kathy with such love and sadness, never realizing that the sadness came from guilt, not grief. "What happens to my boys?" Kyle asked, the question that had been keeping him awake for 3 nights. "Your boys," Whitmore said, "are currently safe with their aunt, who has filed for emergency custody. Dr. Acton has also petitioned to become Catherine's legal guardian, given that her supposed widower was planning to commit bigamy. I'd say their chances of remaining with you are slim to none." Kyle's phone buzzed with another call from a reporter. Since the story had broken, his phone hadn't stopped ringing. The local news had picked up the story first. "Man abandons comatose wife, fakes her death for new marriage." By the second day, it had gone statewide. By the third day, national news outlets were calling it the wedding that exposed 3 years of lies. Social media had been merciless. Someone had posted video from the wedding, showing Joshua and Robin courageously exposing their father's deception. The twins were being called heroes, while Kyle was being labeled everything from sociopath to the worst husband in America. His architectural firm had already terminated his partnership, and the state licensing board had opened an investigation. Harold Morrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, surely we can come to some arrangement that serves everyone's interests. Mr. Barrett is willing to make full restitution." Restitution? Whitmore stood up, his face flushing with anger. "Counselor, your client didn't steal money from a cash register. He stole 3 years of people's lives. He stole my daughter's trust. He stole his children's sense of security. How exactly does one make restitution for that?" Kyle's phone rang again, and this time the caller ID made his blood run cold. "Dr. Sarah Chen," he answered with shaking hands. "Mr. Barrett." The voice belonged to Kathy's primary physician. "I need you to come to the facility immediately. We've been contacted by Emma Acton, who claims to be Mrs. Barrett's sister and is presenting legal documents asserting her right to make medical decisions for the patient." "What kind of legal documents?" Kyle asked, aware that both attorneys were listening intently. "A petition for guardianship, supported by the recent media coverage of your situation. Mr. Barrett, given the circumstances, this facility's administration has decided that all future medical decisions regarding Catherine Acton must be made by her legally appointed guardian. You are no longer authorized to make care decisions." Kyle felt the ground shift beneath him. "You can't keep me from seeing her. She's my wife." Whitmore was already reaching for his phone. "Dr. Chen, this is District Attorney Robert Whitmore. I'm going to need copies of all medical records related to this case for the ongoing criminal investigation. Mr. Barrett is facing multiple felony charges related to fraud." "Criminal investigation?" Dr. Chen's voice carried surprise and concern. "Mr. Barrett is facing charges for document fraud and tax evasion related to his wife's condition," Whitmore explained. "His access to your patient may need to be restricted pending resolution of these charges." 2 hours later, Kyle stood in the parking lot of Greenwood Care Center, staring up at the window of room 247 where Kathy lay. Security had escorted him from the building after serving him with a temporary restraining order. He was no longer allowed to visit his wife, the woman he'd been faithfully visiting for 3 years, even while lying about her existence to everyone else. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "The boys are asking for you, but I won't let them see you until you've faced what you've done to this family. Kathy's condition is stable, but unchanged. She may never wake up to discover her husband is a fraud, and her children have been traumatized by his lies. Think about that, Kyle. Think about what your selfishness has cost everyone who loved you." That evening, Kyle sat alone in his hotel room, surrounded by legal documents and newspaper clippings that detailed his public disgrace. The local news was running a segment about his case, featuring interviews with former clients who felt betrayed, colleagues who questioned everything they thought they knew about him, and legal experts who predicted he would face significant jail time. But the worst part was the interview with Joshua and Robin. Emma had allowed them to speak to reporters, with their faces obscured to protect their privacy. Their young voices, however, were heartbreakingly clear. "We love our daddy," Robin said, his words making Kyle's chest tighten with grief. "But we couldn't let him lie anymore. It was making us feel sick inside, like we were doing something really bad." Joshua's voice was older, more serious. "Our Mama deserves better than being forgotten or lied about. She's been sleeping for 3 years, but she's still our mama. Daddy got scared and tried to pretend she was gone forever, but we never forgot her." The reporter asked if they were angry with their father. "We're not angry," Joshua replied. "We're just sad that he thought lying was easier than telling the truth. We would have understood if he was lonely. We get lonely for Mama too." But we don't understand why he had to pretend she wasn't real anymore. Kyle turned off the television and buried his face in his hands. His 10-year-old sons had shown more courage and integrity in one moment than he'd managed in 3 years. They'd risked their own security to protect the truth about their mother, while he'd built an entire life on a foundation of lies. His phone rang one more time. This time, it was Harold Morrison. "Kyle, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that I've been in contact with the prosecutor's office. They're willing to discuss a plea agreement if you make full restitution and cooperate completely with their investigation. What's the bad news?" "The bad news is that Emma Acton has been granted temporary legal guardianship of both your children and your wife. She's also filed for permanent custody, and given your current circumstances, she has a very strong case. You're looking at supervised visitation at best, Kyle, and that's only if you avoid prison time." Kyle hung up the phone and stared out his hotel window at the city lights below. Somewhere in those lights was Greenwood Care Center, where Kathy lay unchanged, unaware that her husband had betrayed everything they'd once meant to each other. Somewhere else in those lights was a house where his children were learning to trust their aunt instead of their father. He'd thought he was protecting everyone by lying. Instead, he'd destroyed the very family he'd been trying to preserve. And now, as the full weight of his choices crashed down on him, Kyle realized that the real tragedy wasn't Kathy's accident. It was what he'd chosen to do in the aftermath. The reckoning had only just begun, and Kyle was finally beginning to understand that earning forgiveness would require much more than apologies. It would require becoming an entirely different man than the one who'd chosen deception over truth, convenience over character, and self-protection over family loyalty. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey toward accountability. Tonight, he would simply sit with the devastating knowledge of what his lies had cost everyone he'd ever claimed to love. Chapter 3. When Mama Awakens to Betrayal. 6 weeks after Kyle's arrest, Emma Acton sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her sister's hospital bed, reading aloud from Charlotte's Web, one of the books Kathy had loved as a child. The doctors had told Emma that coma patients sometimes responded to familiar voices and stories, though after 3 years, hope for Kathy's recovery had dwindled to a thread. "It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer," Emma read, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that came from juggling her surgical practice in Denver with caring for her nephews and sister in Riverside. As Emma turned the page, she noticed something that made her breath catch. Kathy's eyelids had fluttered, not the random muscle movement the doctors had warned her about, but a deliberate response that seemed timed to Emma's voice. "Kathy," Emma whispered, leaning closer to the bed, "can you hear me, sweetheart?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, Kathy's eyes opened for the first time in 3 years. The awakening process was gradual and confusing. Over the next 2 weeks, Kathy drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware enough to squeeze Emma's hand, other times lost in a haze of medication and neurological recovery. Dr. Chen explained that emerging from a prolonged coma was rarely like the dramatic scenes in movies. It was usually a slow, complicated process of the brain relearning how to maintain consciousness. "The good news," Dr. Chen told Emma, "is that her cognitive function appears largely intact. She's responding appropriately to questions when she's alert, recognizing faces, and showing no signs of major brain damage. The bad news is that she's going to need extensive physical rehabilitation, and the emotional impact of learning about the lost time will be significant." When Kathy was finally alert enough for extended conversation, Emma faced the impossible task of explaining 3 years of lies, betrayal, and legal chaos. She started slowly, gently, Kathy, you've been in a coma for 3 years, Emma said, holding her sister's hand. Do you remember the car accident? Kathy's voice was hoarse and weak, but her memory was sharp. I remember fighting with Kyle about our marriage, about whether we should try counseling. I was angry and I stormed out in the rain. She paused, tears forming in her eyes. The boys, Joshua and Robin, they were 7. They're 10 now? Yes, sweetheart, they're with me, they're safe, and they're so excited that you're awake. Over the next several days, as Kathy's physical strength slowly returned, Emma revealed the truth about Kyle's deception piece by devastating piece. She showed Kathy newspaper articles about the wedding scandal, court documents from Kyle's criminal case, and photos of Joshua and Robin from the past 3 years. Birthdays, school, events and milestones that Kathy had missed while unconscious. He told people I was dead. Kathy asked on the 4th day, her voice stronger now but hollow with disbelief. She was sitting up in bed, her auburn hair freshly washed but still thin from 3 years of medical care. Emma nodded grimly. He moved to Millbrook about 6 months after your accident. Started completely over. New job, new friends, new life. He told everyone his wife had died in a car crash. Kathy stared out the window at the spring flowers blooming in the hospital garden. She remembered the accident with painful clarity. The fight with Kyle about their failing marriage, about how they'd grown apart, about whether they should try counseling or just admit defeat. She remembered grabbing her keys in anger, storming out into the rain. She remembered the last thing she'd said to him. Maybe it would be easier if I just disappeared. But he visited me, Kathy said, confusion and hurt warring in her voice. The nurses said he came every weekend. He read to me, talked to me. He did, Emma confirmed, but Monday through Thursday, he was building a completely different life. Dating, getting engaged, planning a wedding. Emma pulled out her tablet and showed Kathy screenshots of news articles. The boys exposed him at his wedding ceremony, Kathy. They couldn't let him go through with it. Kathy studied the headlines with growing horror. Man abandons comatose wife, fakes her death for new marriage. Wedding stopped by brave children exposing father's lies. The boys who saved their mother's honor. My babies, Kathy whispered, tears streaming down her face. They had to carry that secret. They had to be the adults because Kyle couldn't be. Emma reached for her hand. There's more, sweetheart. He was filing false tax returns as a widower, planning to move the boys across the country without telling anyone you were alive. He was going to commit bigamy rather than tell his fiancée the truth. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical pain of her recovery. Kathy had loved Kyle since. She was 22 years old. They'd built a life together, created 2 beautiful children, weathered the normal struggles of marriage and parenthood. Yes, they'd been having problems before the accident. They'd grown apart, stopped communicating effectively, let work and stress erode their connection. But she'd never imagined Kyle could be capable of such systematic deception. Where is he? Now? Kathy asked. Facing criminal charges. He's lost his architectural license, his job, most of his assets. I filed for emergency custody of the boys and guardianship over you. Given his legal situation, the court granted both requests. On the 10th day of her awakening, Kathy was finally strong enough to see Joshua and Robin. Emma brought them to the hospital during visiting hours, and Kathy had spent 2 hours preparing herself emotionally for seeing the children she'd lost 3 years of raising. When they walked into her room, Kathy's heart broke and soared simultaneously. They were so much taller, their faces leaner and more mature. Joshua's hair was darker now, and he carried himself with a gravity that no 10-year-old should possess. Robin still had his gentle eyes and quick smile, but there was a wariness there that spoke of difficult lessons learned too young. Mama? Robin's voice was tentative, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Come here, my babies, Kathy said, opening her arms. They rushed to her bedside, and suddenly they were 7 years old again. crying and clinging to her as if they could make up for 3 lost years through the intensity of their embrace. Kathy held them as tightly as her weakened arms would allow, breathing in their scent, memorizing the weight of them against her chest. "I'm sorry, Mama." Joshua sobbed against her shoulder. "I'm sorry we kept Daddy's secret for so long. We thought we were protecting you. And I'm sorry we had to tell everyone the truth about Daddy," Robin added, his small body shaking with tears. "We didn't want to hurt him, but we couldn't let him forget about you." Kathy pulled back to look at their faces, cupping their cheeks in her hands. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. You were asked to carry burdens that belong to adults, not children. You protected the truth when the grown-ups around you weren't brave enough to do it themselves." "But Daddy's in trouble now," Joshua said, his green eyes, so much like Kyle's, filled with confusion and guilt. "People are saying mean things about him. He might go to jail." Kathy felt her heart twist with the complexity of her emotions. She was furious with Kyle, devastated by his betrayal, heartbroken over the lost years. But these children loved their father despite everything, and they were suffering because of his choices. "Your daddy made some very bad decisions," Kathy said carefully. "He chose to lie instead of telling the truth about difficult things, but that doesn't mean he doesn't love you, and it doesn't mean you're responsible for the consequences of his choices." Robin climbed carefully onto the bed beside her, snuggling against her side, with the easy affection she remembered from when he was little. "Are you mad at us for living with Aunt Emma instead of Daddy?" "Oh, sweetheart, no." Kathy stroked his hair, marveling at how soft it still was. "I'm grateful to Aunt Emma for taking care of you when I couldn't, and I understand why you can't live with Daddy right now. He has to face what he's done and prove that he can be trusted to take care of you." Joshua remained standing, his expression serious beyond his years. "Mama, do you hate Daddy?" The question hit Kathy like a physical blow. She'd been asking herself the same thing since learning the truth. Did she hate Kyle? Part of her did. The part that felt erased, abandoned, betrayed. But another part of her remembered the man who'd sat by her bedside for 3 years, reading her favorite books, playing her favorite music, talking to her about their children's achievements and struggles. "I don't hate your daddy," she said slowly, "but I'm very hurt by what he did, and I'm angry that he put you boys in such a terrible position. Love and hurt can exist at the same time, baby. It's one of the hardest things about being human." They spent the next hour catching up on 3 years of missed moments. The boys showed her photos on Emma's phone, birthday parties she'd missed, school plays she hadn't seen, report cards she hadn't signed. They told her about friends she didn't know, teachers she'd never met, hobbies they'd developed in her absence. "We saved everything for you," Robin said earnestly. "All our artwork from school, our good report cards, even our loose teeth for the tooth fairy. Aunt Emma said you'd want to see it all when you woke up." "We never stopped believing you'd come back," Joshua added. "Even when Daddy said you were in heaven, we knew you were really just sleeping here, waiting for the right time to wake up." When visiting hours ended and Emma took the boys home, Kathy lay in her hospital bed staring at the ceiling. The physical therapist had told her that her recovery was progressing well. Her cognitive function was almost completely restored, and her muscle tone was improving daily with therapy. But the emotional recovery would be much harder. She'd lost 3 years of her children's lives. She'd missed Halloween costumes and Christmas mornings, first days of school and playground injuries, bedtime stories and homework help. Those years were gone forever, and no amount of healing could bring them back. But worse than the lost time was the knowledge that Kyle had systematically erased her from their lives while building a new existence based on her supposed death. He'd used her tragedy as a foundation for sympathy and romance. He'd taught their children to participate in deception. He'd been prepared to commit bigamy, rather than face the truth about their complicated situation. Dr. Chen stopped by that evening during her final rounds. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Barrett? I know today was emotionally difficult." "Actually," Kathy said quietly, "it's Ms. Acton now, or it will be, once my lawyer files the divorce paperwork. I'm going back to my maiden name." Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. "Of course, I should mention that your husband has been asking to see you. He's called several times since you woke up, and his attorney has submitted formal requests for visitation. There are legal restrictions in place due to his current charges, but if you wanted to see him—" "No," Kathy said firmly. "I'm not ready. For that. I may never be ready for that." "I understand completely, and Ms. Acton, I want you to know that in 30 years of medicine, I've rarely seen children show the kind of courage your boys displayed. They saved their family in the truest sense of the word." That night, as Kathy drifted toward natural sleep for the first time in 3 years, she thought about the choice Kyle had made. He could have told the truth about her condition, could have sought support and understanding from friends and family. Instead, he'd chosen deception, isolation, and ultimately betrayal. But Joshua and Robin had chosen differently. When faced with an impossible burden, they'd chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenience. At 10 years old, they'd shown more integrity than their father had managed in 3 years. Kathy closed her eyes and whispered a promise into the darkness. "I'm going to make sure you never have to be the adults again. From now on, the grown-ups will handle the grown-up problems." Tomorrow, she would begin the hard work of rebuilding her life and her relationship with her children. Tonight, she would simply be grateful to be awake, aware, and finally ready to face whatever truth awaited her family. The woman who had been systematically erased from her own life was ready to write herself back into existence, not as Kyle's victim, but as Joshua and Robin's mother, as Emma's sister, and as her own person, stronger for having survived both the accident and the betrayal that followed. Chapter 4. Legal Warfare. The Riverside County Family Court building stood like a monument to broken dreams, its grey concrete facade reflecting the overcast November sky. Kyle Barrett sat in the defendant's chair, his once expensive suit now wrinkled and ill-fitting, after weeks of stress-induced weight loss. Across the aisle, Kathy sat beside her attorney, Margaret Thornfield, a woman whose reputation for protecting clients from abusive situations was legendary in legal circles. "Your Honor," Harold Morrison began, his voice lacking the confidence that usually characterized criminal defense attorneys, "my client wishes to enter a plea of guilty to all charges of marriage fraud, insurance fraud, and perjury. We ask the court to consider that Mr. Barrett's actions, while inexcusable, were born from overwhelming grief and depression following his wife's tragic accident. Judge Elena Rodriguez, a no-nonsense woman with 20 years on the family court bench, studied Kyle with the expression of someone who had seen every variation of human weakness and deception. "Mr. Barrett, do you understand that by pleading guilty to these charges, you are admitting to a pattern of deliberate fraud spanning 3 years? Kyle stood on unsteady legs. "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you understand that these charges carry potential prison sentences totaling up to 15 years? "Yes, Your Honor." Margaret Thornfield rose gracefully, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge Mr. Barrett's guilty plea on the criminal charges, we are here today to address the more pressing matter of child custody and support. Mr. Barrett's crimes extend far beyond financial fraud. He systematically erased his children's mother from their lives while teaching them to participate in his deception." She approached the evidence table, where boxes of documents chronicled 3 years of Kyle's double life. The evidence will show that Mr. Barrett didn't simply tell a few lies to spare people's feelings. He orchestrated a complete fiction, turning his wife's tragedy into a tool for personal gain, while forcing his children to become accomplices in his betrayal. The first piece of evidence was devastating in its thoroughness. Kyle had removed every photograph of Kathy from their home, boxing them up and storing them in a storage unit. He deleted her from social media, changed emergency contacts at the boys' school to list himself as a widower, and even had fake memorial service programs printed to show to people who asked about his late wife. "Your Honor," Thornfield continued, "this wasn't grief. This was calculated erasure. Mr. Barrett didn't just lie about his wife's death. He systematically worked to make it true in every way, except the biological." Emma Acton took the witness stand first, her composure admirable considering the circumstances. As a pediatric surgeon, she was accustomed to delivering difficult truths with clinical precision. "Dr. Acton," Thornfield began, "when did you first learn about your sister's condition?" 3 years ago, when Kyle called to tell me Kathy had died in a car accident," Emma replied, her voice steady but cold. "He asked me not to come to the funeral because it would be too difficult for the boys. I respected his wishes and grieved. My sister's death from Denver. When did you discover the truth?" 4 weeks ago, when I saw the news coverage of his interrupted wedding. I flew to Riverside immediately and discovered that my sister was alive and had been receiving care at Greenwood for 3 years. Kyle had been visiting her regularly while telling the world she was dead. Judge Rodriguez leaned forward. "Doctor Acton, did Mr. Barrett ever contact you during those 3 years? Ask for help with the children? Mention any struggles he was having?" "No, Your Honor. He maintained complete silence for 3 years. If I'd known Kathy was alive, I would have moved heaven and earth to help care for her and the boys. Instead, I was mourning a sister who wasn't dead while Kyle was using her condition to build sympathy for himself with other women. Harold Morrison's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. How could he challenge the testimony of a woman who'd been lied to about her sister's death for 3 years? The most damaging evidence came from Kyle's own phone and computer. Thornfield's investigator had recovered deleted dating profiles, where Kyle described himself as a devoted widower and single father, seeking companionship after the tragic loss of his beloved wife. Messages to multiple women where he shared fabricated stories about Kathy's death and his journey through grief. Photos he'd sent to potential dates showing himself at a cemetery, standing over an unmarked grave where he claimed Kathy was buried. "Your Honor," Thornfield said, presenting the evidence methodically, "Mr. Barrett wasn't simply hiding his wife's condition, he was actively profiting from it emotionally and financially. He used her tragedy as a foundation for romantic relationships, painting himself as a heroic figure who'd overcome devastating loss. But the most heartbreaking evidence came when Joshua and Robin were called to testify. The judge had ordered that their testimony be conducted in chambers with only essential personnel present, but their words were recorded for the official record. Joshua, now 11 but speaking with the gravity of someone much older, described the impossible position his father had put them in. "Daddy told us that Mama was watching us from heaven, but then every Friday he would drive to see her at the place where she was sleeping. He said if we told anyone about the visits, it would make people sad and confused. How did that make you feel?" The court-appointed child advocate asked gently. "Scared," Joshua admitted. "We loved Daddy, but we knew lying was wrong, and we missed Mama so much. It felt like Daddy was trying to make us forget her, but we didn't want to forget her." Robin's testimony was even more devastating. The younger twin, still small for his age and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, described how Kyle had gradually removed all traces of Kathy from their lives. "Daddy put away all of Mama's pictures," Robin said, tears streaming down his face. "He said it was too sad to look at them. But I wanted to remember what she looked like. Sometimes I would sneak into his room and look at the one picture he kept in his wallet. "What did your father tell you about your mother's condition?" the advocate asked. "He said Mama was an angel watching over us from heaven, but then he would come home from visiting her and be really sad. It was confusing because if Mama was happy in heaven, why was Daddy so sad after talking to her?" The child psychologist who had evaluated the boys testified that both children showed signs of emotional trauma consistent with being forced to participate in adult deception. "These children were put in an impossible position," Dr. Sarah Walsh explained. "They were told their mother was dead, while simultaneously being asked to keep secret the fact that their father was visiting her. This kind of psychological splitting can cause significant developmental damage." Kyle's attorney tried to mount a defense based on temporary insanity and overwhelming grief, but the evidence of calculated deception over 3 years made such arguments impossible to sustain. Financial records showed that Kyle had carefully planned his move to Millbrook, researching the area and securing employment months before relocating. Dating app records showed he'd been actively seeking relationships within weeks of moving, using his widower status as a primary selling point. "Your Honor," Harold Morrison said in his closing argument, "my client made terrible choices while in the grip of complicated grief. He should have sought help, should have been honest about his situation. But he was a man drowning in circumstances beyond his control, trying to create some semblance of normalcy for his children." Margaret Thornfield's response was swift and devastating. "Your Honor, Mr. Barrett wasn't drowning, he was calculating. Every aspect of his deception required planning, execution, and maintenance. He created fake memorial programs. He researched dating platforms. He opened bank accounts to hide his financial support of his wife's care. This wasn't grief. This was fraud on a massive scale." She gestured toward the evidence table. "Mr. Barrett didn't just lie about his wife's death. He monetized it. He collected life insurance benefits. He filed fraudulent tax returns. He used his tragedy to gain sympathy and romantic interest from women. And throughout it all, he forced his children to participate in his deception while visiting the wife he'd supposedly buried every single weekend." Judge Rodriguez took a 2-hour recess before delivering her verdict. When court reconvened, her expression left no doubt about her feelings regarding Kyle's conduct. "Mr. Barrett," she began, "in 30 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered such a systematic pattern of deception and emotional manipulation. Your actions have traumatized your children, defrauded multiple institutions, and shown a complete disregard for the truth and the people who trusted you." Kyle stood, his legs barely supporting him. "On the criminal charges, I sentence you to 2 years probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and full financial restitution to all defrauded parties. You will surrender your passport and remain in this jurisdiction for the duration of your probation." She turned to the custody matter. "Regarding the children, I am awarding full legal and physical custody to Catherine Acton, with Emma Acton maintaining her role as guardian ad litem. Mr. Barrett, you will be permitted supervised visitation with your children for 4 hours on the first Sunday of each month, contingent upon your compliance with all court orders and your completion of mandatory counseling." Kyle's knees buckled, and he gripped the defendant's table for support. "Furthermore," Judge Rodriguez continued, "you will pay child support in the amount of $3,000 per month, plus all medical and educational expenses for both children. You will also continue to pay all costs associated with Ms. Acton's ongoing medical care and rehabilitation." The financial obligations alone would bankrupt him, but Kyle barely registered the numbers. 4 hours a month. That's all he would have with his children. 4 supervised hours every 30 days to try to rebuild a relationship he destroyed through his own choices. Your Honor, Harold Morrison began, we request consideration for increased visitation. Denied. Judge Rodriguez cut him off. Mr. Barrett will need to prove, through consistent action and genuine rehabilitation, that he can be trusted with the welfare of these children. Given the psychological damage he has inflicted through his deception, I consider this arrangement generous. As court adjourned, Kyle watched Kathy embrace Joshua and Robin. She was still using a walker, still regaining her strength, but she was there, present, honest, real. Everything he'd failed to be for 3 years. Emma approached Kyle as he gathered his papers. Kyle, I want you to know that Kathy and I will never prevent the boys from loving you. But they need to see that actions have consequences, and that trust, once broken, must be earned back through consistent behavior over time. Kyle nodded numbly. How is she? Really? Stronger than you gave her credit for, Emma replied. She's relearning to walk, to write, to live independently. But emotionally, she's devastated by your betrayal. You didn't just abandon her, Kyle, you erased her. And now she has to rebuild her identity while dealing with the trauma of what you did to our family. That evening, Kyle sat in his cramped studio apartment, surrounded by legal documents that chronicled the complete destruction of his life. He'd lost his career, his home, his family, and his reputation. Ahead of him stretched years of probation, community service, and the monthly humiliation of supervised visits with his own children. But for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't living a lie. The truth was ugly, painful, and devastating, but it was finally the truth. And perhaps, Kyle thought as he stared at a photo of Joshua and Robin from happier times, truth was the only foundation on which any kind of redemption could be built. His next supervised visit was 30 days away. He had 30 days to figure out how to begin earning back the right to be their father again. Chapter 5. The Price of Betrayal. Kyle's new apartment was a 400-square-foot studio in the worst part of Riverside, sandwiched between a laundromat that ran all night and a convenience store with bars on its windows. The building smelled like cigarettes and despair, with flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway that made everything look sickly yellow. Kyle's furniture consisted of a fold-out couch from Goodwill, a card table missing one leg that he'd propped up with phone books, and a single chair that creaked ominously whenever he sat down. The walls were bare, except for one photo of Joshua and Robin, taken at Christmas 2 years before the accident, when they'd been a complete family. Sometimes Kyle would stare at that photo for hours, trying to remember what it felt like to be the kind of man who deserved the trust shining in his children's eyes. The morning alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., same as every weekday for the past 4 months since his release from jail. Kyle had served 60 days for contempt of court after violating his restraining order, and the experience had broken something inside him that he was still struggling to rebuild. Prison, even for such a short time, had shown him exactly where his choices were leading. Kyle rolled off the uncomfortable couch that served as his bed and reached for his work clothes. Heavy denim jeans that were already wearing thin at the day, knees, steel-toed boots that had been donated by a church charity, and a high-visibility vest that marked him as a laborer rather than the licensed architect he'd once been. By 5:30 a.m., Kyle was standing in the pre-dawn darkness at a job site. Across town, part of a crew demolishing old buildings to make way for new development. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He was now being paid $12 an hour to tear down structures while his former colleagues designed and built new ones. "Barrett!" The foreman's voice cut through the morning air. "You're on sledgehammer. A duty today. 3rd floor, tear out all the interior walls." Kyle nodded and headed for the building, his tool belt heavy around his waist. Demolition work was hard, dirty, and mindless, exactly what he needed. For 8 hours a day, he could lose himself in the rhythm of swinging a sledgehammer, tearing down walls, while trying not to think about how thoroughly he'd demolished his own life. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in Emma's suburban home, a different and kind of demolition was taking place. Robin Barrett sat at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of cereal that had long since gone soggy, his 10-year-old body trembling with anxiety that seemed to have no source or solution. The change in Robin had been gradual but devastating. In the 3 months since Kathy had awakened and filed for divorce, Robin had started having panic attacks that left him gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably. He'd lost 12 pounds from his already small frame, and dark circles under. His eyes made him look haunted. "Robin, sweetheart, you need to eat something," Emma said gently, sitting beside him at the table. She'd taken a leave of absence from her surgical practice in Denver to care for her sister and nephews, but she was beginning to realize that her medical training hadn't prepared her for this level of family trauma. Robin didn't respond. He hadn't spoken a word in 2 weeks, not since the court-mandated family therapy session, where he'd been asked to choose which parent he wanted to live with. The question had been too much for his young mind to process. How could he choose between a mother who was relearning how to live and a father who had betrayed everything he'd once believed about truth and love? Joshua emerged from his bedroom, already dressed for school, but moving with the careful control of someone much older than 10. Since the custody hearing, he'd appointed himself as Robin's protector and Kathy's guardian, shouldering responsibilities that should never fall to a child. "He had another nightmare last night," Joshua reported to Emma, his voice clinical and detached. "He was calling for Daddy, but then he woke up and remembered everything and started crying." Emma's heart broke. For both boys, they were caught in an emotional no-man's land, loving a father they could no longer trust, missing a man who had systematically betrayed their family. The court-appointed therapist had explained that children often blame themselves when their parents' marriages fail, but this situation was far more complex than typical divorce trauma. "I want to see Mama," Joshua announced. "I want to tell her that Robin isn't eating again, and that the kids at school are asking questions about Daddy being in the news." Emma nodded. They'd been visiting Kathy at the rehabilitation center every day, watching her slowly rebuild the physical and emotional strength that Kyle's betrayal had cost her. Kathy was making remarkable progress with physical therapy. She could walk short distances with assistance, her cognitive function was almost completely restored, and she was beginning to talk about returning to work as a pediatric nurse. But the emotional healing was proving much more difficult. At Riverside Rehabilitation Center, Kathy sat in her wheelchair by the window, watching other families navigate their own recoveries and wondering if her children would ever feel secure again. The view from her room overlooked the parking lot, where Kyle used to park his silver Honda when he made his secret weekend visits. The irony was crushing. She was in the same facility where he'd spent 3 years visiting her, but now she was awake, and he was the one who was absent. Miss Acton. Dr. Jennifer Ross, her therapist, approached with a folder full of paperwork. "How are you feeling today?" "Guilty," Kathy replied honestly. It was the answer she gave most days. The guilt had become a constant companion. Guilt about the years she'd lost while unconscious, guilt about the burden her awakening had placed on Emma, guilt about the impossible position Kyle's lies had put their children in. "Tell me about the guilt," Dr. Ross said, settling into the chair across from her. "I keep thinking about all the ways this could have been different," Kathy said. "If I hadn't stormed out that night, if Kyle and I had gone to counseling instead of fighting, if I'd been a better wife, maybe he wouldn't have felt the need to replace me." Dr. Ross shook her head firmly. "Ms. Acton, your husband's decision to lie about your death wasn't caused by your marriage problems. It was caused by his inability to handle difficult emotions honestly. You are not responsible for his choice to deceive everyone who trusted him." The truth was that Kyle's requests for contact had become increasingly desperate and frequent. Every day brought new letters slipped under the door of Emma's house, left at the rehabilitation center, or handed to mutual acquaintances with pleas for delivery. Kathy had read the first few, but they'd all followed the same pattern: desperate apologies, explanations about his grief and loneliness, promises to do better if she'd just give him a chance. The letters made everything worse because they showed that Kyle still didn't understand the magnitude of what he'd done. He wrote about missing her, about wanting to rebuild their relationship, about how much he'd suffered during her coma. But he never addressed the central issue. He had systematically erased her from their children's lives while using her condition for personal gain. When Emma arrived with Joshua and Robin that afternoon, Kathy immediately noticed Robin's continued deterioration. The 10-year-old climbed into her lap with the desperate clinging of a child seeking safety in an unstable world, but he remained silent when she asked him about school, about his friends, about his dreams. "Mama," Joshua said, his voice tight. With controlled emotion, "Robin won't talk to anyone anymore, and he's having accidents at night like when he was little." Kathy looked down at her younger son, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his small frame seemed to have shrunk even further. "Baby," she whispered, stroking his hair. "What's hurting you so much that you can't find words for it?" Robin buried his face against her shoulder, but remained silent. Dr. Walsh, the child psychologist, had explained that forcing him to speak would only make the mutism worse, but watching her child suffer in silence was agony for Kathy. "He misses Daddy," Joshua said bluntly, "but he's also scared of Daddy, and he doesn't know how to feel both things at the same time." The simple truth from a 10-year-old cut straight to the heart of their family's trauma. Kyle's betrayal had created an impossible emotional situation for the boys. They loved their father but couldn't trust him, needed him but couldn't be with him, wanted to forgive him but didn't know how. "I miss Daddy too," Joshua continued, his careful composure finally cracking. "But I'm so angry at him, Mama. He made us lie. He made us help him pretend you weren't real anymore. He made us choose between loving you and loving him." Kathy pulled Joshua into her embrace alongside Robin, holding both boys as they finally allowed themselves to cry for the father they'd lost to his own choices. It was progress, Dr. Walsh had told her, letting themselves grieve the relationship they'd had with Kyle before they could begin to consider what relationship might be possible in the future. That evening, as Emma drove the boys home from their visit, Joshua made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I want to write a letter to Daddy," he said, "not to forgive him or to ask him to come home, but to tell him how much he hurt us. Maybe if he understands how bad it's been for Robin, he'll stop sending those letters that make Mama cry." Emma glanced in the rearview mirror at Joshua's serious face. "What would you want to say to him?" "I want to tell him that Robin doesn't talk anymore because Daddy taught him that words can be lies. I want to tell him that Mama cries every night because she missed 3 years of our lives. And I want to tell him that if he really loves us, he'll stop trying to make us choose sides and start proving that he can be honest." Meanwhile, Kyle was returning to his studio apartment after another 16-hour day, taking extra shifts to afford the court-ordered payments that consumed most of his income. The loneliness had become unbearable, but what made it worse was the knowledge that his suffering was entirely self-inflicted. He stopped at his mailbox and found what he'd been dreading, another returned letter from Kathy, this one marked "Refused" in Emma's sharp handwriting. Attached was a note. "Kyle, your letters are making her recovery harder. If you truly love her, you'll give her the space she needs to heal from what you did to our family." That night, Kyle sat on his fold-out couch surrounded by the returned letters Kathy had refused to read. Every attempt at contact had failed. Every gesture of remorse had been rejected. Every promise of change had fallen on deaf ears. For the first time since the wedding disaster, Kyle began to understand that love wasn't about his needs or his emotional comfort. Love was about what was best for the people he claimed to care about. And what was best for Kathy and the boys was for him to stop trying to force his way back into their lives and start proving through actions, not words, that he could become worthy of their trust. Kyle pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, not another letter to Kathy or the boys, but a letter to his attorney. If he was going to have any chance of redemption, he would have to earn it through consistent, humble action rather than desperate attempts at manipulation. The demolition of Kyle Barrett's old life was finally complete. Now, if he was very lucky and worked harder than he'd ever worked before, maybe he could begin the even more difficult task of building something worthy from the rubble. But first, he had to learn the difference between loving someone and earning the right to be part of their life. The education would take years, and there were no guarantees of success. The only certainty was that his family deserved better than the man he'd been, and becoming that better man was the only path forward that didn't lead to complete despair. Chapter 6. The Humbling Begins. The revelation came to Kyle on a Tuesday evening in February, 6 months after losing his supervised visitation rights. He sat in his cramped apartment, staring at another returned letter from Kathy, this one marked "refused" in Emma's sharp handwriting, when the futility of his approach finally hit him with crystalline clarity. Letters wouldn't rebuild trust. Explanations wouldn't undo trauma. Grand gestures wouldn't erase 3 years of systematic deception. If Kyle wanted any chance of redemption, he would have to earn it through the one thing he'd never truly offered his family: consistent, humble action without expectation of reward. The next morning, instead of reporting to the construction site, Kyle drove to Riverside Elementary School. The building looked different in the pale winter sunlight, smaller than he remembered from parent-teacher conferences and school plays that felt like they'd happened in another lifetime. He sat in his truck for 20 minutes, gathering courage, before walking into the administrative office. "I'm here about the night custodian position," he told the secretary, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Chen, who clearly didn't recognize him. "Oh, wonderful," she replied, pulling out an application. "We've been short-staffed for months. The hours are 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., Monday through Friday. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady." Kyle filled out the application honestly, listing his architectural background, but not mentioning why he was no longer licensed. When Mrs. Chen asked about his interest in school custodial work, he answered simply, "I want to be around children's education. I want to contribute to their learning environment." It wasn't the complete truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Kyle did want to contribute to his children's world, even if they would never know he was there. 2 weeks later, Kyle Barrett, former architect, convicted fraudster, and estranged father, began his new career mopping floors and emptying trash cans at the school his children attended. He arrived every evening at 6 p.m. sharp, after Joshua and Robin had gone home with Emma, and worked through the night, ensuring their classrooms were clean and ready for the next day's learning. The work was honest in a way Kyle hadn't experienced in years. There were no client meetings, no complex negotiations, no opportunities for deception or cutting corners. There was only the simple dignity of physical labor, the satisfaction of leaving something better than he'd found it. Kyle made it a point to learn every teacher's name, every classroom's specific needs. Mrs. Patterson's third-grade room required extra attention around the art station, where glitter had a way of embedding itself in every surface. Mr. Rodriguez's fifth-grade classroom needed the whiteboards cleaned, with special solution to prevent ghosting. The kindergarten rooms needed gentle handling of the reading corners, where tiny chairs and picture books created miniature worlds of wonder. He learned which classroom was Joshua's and which was Robin's, though he was careful never to linger there longer than any other room. But sometimes, when he was cleaning Joshua's desk or emptying Robin's classroom trash can, Kyle would allow himself a moment to touch something his children had touched, to exist briefly in their world, even if they would never know he'd been there. 3 weeks into his custodial work, Kyle began attending therapy with Dr. Michael Santos, a grief counselor who specialized in complicated mourning and family trauma. The sessions were brutal in their honesty. "Tell me about your relationship with truth," Dr. Santos said during their third meeting. Kyle shifted uncomfortably in the worn leather chair. "I used to think I was protecting people by lying, protecting them from difficult realities, from complicated emotions they might not understand. And now? Now I realize I was protecting myself," Kyle admitted. "It was easier to lie about Kathy's condition than to face the complex grief of loving someone who couldn't love me back. It was easier to create a simple story about being a widower than to explain the reality of visiting a wife who didn't know I was there." Dr. Santos nodded. "Grief, for someone who is alive but absent, is one of the most difficult emotional experiences humans can face. But you chose to hide from that grief rather than process it. Why?" Kyle was quiet for a long moment. "Because I thought if I admitted how hard it was, if I let people see how much I was struggling, they would think I was weak, or selfish, or not good enough to be a father to my boys. And instead I became exactly what I was afraid people would think I was." The therapy sessions became a twice-weekly appointment Kyle never missed, even when working double shifts to afford them. Dr. Santos helped him understand that his lies hadn't begun with the move to Millbrook. They'd started in the hospital, a room where Kathy lay unconscious. When Kyle began telling himself that visiting her was enough, that maintaining her medical care absolved him of the harder work of honest communication with his children. "Your boys needed to grieve their mother too," Dr. Santos pointed out. "By telling them she was dead, you robbed them of the chance to process their own complex feelings about her condition." Kyle also began volunteering at the Riverside Brain Injury Support Center, spending his Saturday mornings helping other families navigate the impossible terrain of loving someone whose consciousness existed in liminal space between life and death. The work was emotionally grueling, but it taught Kyle what he should have learned 3 years earlier, that truth, however complicated, was always better than convenient fiction. He met other spouses who visited their partners every day, other parents who struggled to explain traumatic brain injury to confused children, other families who had found ways to honor love while building realistic hope. None of them had chosen Kyle's path of erasure and deception. "My wife has been in a vegetative state for 5 years, shared Marcus, a man Kyle's age, whose wife had suffered an aneurysm. "My kids visit her every week. They read to her, tell her about school, show her their artwork. It's hard, but it's honest. They know their mother loves them, even if she can't show it right now." Kyle listened to these stories with growing shame and understanding. He had robbed Joshua and Robin of the chance to love their mother in her current state, to hope for her recovery while accepting her present reality. Instead, he'd forced them to choose between loyalty to their dead mother and excitement about their father's new life. On Tuesday evenings, Kyle attended parenting classes at the community center, sitting in a circle with other parents who were working to improve their relationships with their children. Most of them were there because of divorce, addiction, or anger management issues. Kyle was there because he'd committed fraud and taught his children to lie. "Parenting isn't about being perfect," the instructor Maria Santos explained. "It's about modeling how to handle imperfection. Children need to see that adults can make mistakes, take responsibility, and work to do better." Kyle took careful notes, absorbing lessons he should have learned a decade earlier. how to apologize without making excuses, how to rebuild trust through consistent action rather than grand promises, how to put children's emotional needs ahead of adult comfort. For 6 months, Kyle didn't request increased visitation or ask his attorney to petition for expanded contact with the boys. He didn't send letters or gifts or messages through intermediaries. He simply worked to become a better person, knowing that any relationship with his children would have to be built on a foundation of genuine change rather than desperate manipulation. The transformation was slow but noticeable. Kyle stopped drinking alcohol completely, recognizing that his weekend visits to bars had been another form of avoiding difficult emotions. He started exercising regularly, finding that physical health supported emotional stability. He read books about trauma, grief, and family psychology, educating himself about the damage he'd inflicted and the long road to potential healing. Most importantly, Kyle stopped defending his actions, even to himself. In therapy, in parenting classes, in support groups, he practiced taking full responsibility for his choices without minimizing their impact or explaining away their motivations. When his supervised visitation rights were finally restored after the 6-month suspension, Kyle approached the first meeting with humility rather than desperation. The court-appointed supervisor, Linda Martinez, met with him beforehand to establish ground rules. "Mr. Barrett, I want to be clear about expectations," Linda said. "These visits are about your children's well-being, not your emotional needs. If they don't want to talk about their mother, you don't push. If they express anger about your choices, you listen without defending yourself. If they seem uncomfortable, we end the visit early." "I understand," Kyle replied simply. "I just want to see them." The first visit took place in a sterile conference room at the Family Services building. Joshua and Robin entered with Emma, both boys visibly nervous and uncertain. Robin, now 12, had regained his ability to speak, but remained cautious and easily startled. Joshua, also 12 and tall for his age, carried himself with the protective wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Hi, boys," Kyle said quietly, making no move to approach them. "Thank you for coming." Joshua studied his father carefully, noting the changes 6 months of honest labor and therapy had wrought. Kyle was thinner, his hands rough from manual work, his clothes simple and clean but clearly inexpensive. Most importantly, there was something different about his demeanor, a humility that hadn't existed before. "Are you still working at our school?" Robin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle nodded. "I'm a custodian there. I clean the classrooms and make sure everything is ready for you and your classmates to learn." "Do you see our work on the walls?" Joshua asked, testing his father's honesty. "Sometimes," Kyle admitted. "I'm proud of how well you're both doing in school, but I try not to spend extra time in your classrooms. That wouldn't be appropriate given our situation." It was a small moment, but significant. The old Kyle would have claimed he never noticed their work to avoid seeming intrusive, or would have gushed about how wonderful their projects were to curry favor. This Kyle simply told the truth. Complex, imperfect, honest truth. For the next 3 hours they sat together awkwardly, the boys gradually relaxing as they realized their father wasn't going to pressure them for forgiveness or flood them with explanations. Instead, Kyle asked about their interests, their friends, their hopes for the upcoming school year. He listened without offering advice or trying to insert himself into their lives. When Robin mentioned having nightmares, Kyle didn't immediately offer to help or promise to make them better. Instead, he said, "That sounds really scary. I'm glad you have Aunt Emma and Mama to help you feel safe." When Joshua expressed anger about having to change schools because of all the drama, Kyle didn't defend himself or minimize the impact of his choices. He simply said, "I'm sorry my actions caused so much disruption in your life. You deserved stability, and I failed to provide that." As the visit ended, Linda Martinez was cautiously optimistic about Kyle's behavior. "Mr. Barrett," she said privately, "you showed appropriate restraint today. However, rebuilding trust will require many more visits like this one. The boys seem less tense than I expected, but we'll need to see consistent improvement over time." Joshua and Robin left without hugging their father, but also without the tension and anger that had characterized their interactions during the custody proceedings. It was progress, small, fragile, but real. That night, Kyle returned to his studio apartment and wrote in the journal Dr. Santos had recommended. He didn't write about his pain or his regrets or his hopes for reconciliation. Instead, he wrote about his children, their resilience, their cautious bravery, their clear need for consistent truth rather than dramatic gestures. The work of earning back the right to be their father had begun. It would take years, Kyle understood, and there were no guarantees of success. But for the first time since the wedding disaster, Kyle was building his efforts on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. Tomorrow, he would mop floors and empty trash cans at his children's school. He would attend therapy and parenting classes. He would volunteer with other traumatic brain injury families. He would live humbly and work consistently, proving through actions that he had finally learned the difference between loving someone and earning the right to be part of their life. The humbling had begun, and with it, the first real possibility of redemption. Chapter 7. Earning through service. 1 year later, Kyle Barrett's life had settled into a rhythm of quiet purpose. The calendar on his kitchen wall marked 365 days of perfect compliance with every court order, 365 days of on-time child support payments, completed community service hours, and monthly supervised visits that had gradually grown less strained and more genuine. His studio apartment remained spartanly furnished, but now it held evidence of a man rebuilding himself from the ground up. Certificates from completed parenting classes lined one wall. A small bookshelf held volumes on child psychology, grief counseling, and traumatic brain injury recovery. The card table that served as his desk was covered with carefully organized files, therapy session notes, volunteer schedules, and architectural sketches for a new specialty he'd been developing. Kyle had discovered his calling in accessible design. Working with families at the Brain Injury Support Center had opened his eyes to the complex needs of people living with disabilities, and he'd begun specializing in home modifications and adaptive construction. Though he couldn't practice architecture, without his license, he could work as a contractor specializing in wheelchair ramps, accessible bathrooms, and adaptive living spaces. The work paid modestly, but fed his soul in ways his former prestigious projects never had. Every handrail he installed, every doorway he widened, every bathroom he modified helped someone live more independently. It was honest work that served real human needs, and Kyle found deep satisfaction in using his skills to improve rather than impress. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, his fellow volunteer at the support center. "Mrs. Patterson's ramp is finished." She cried when she was able to get onto her front porch independently for the first time in 3 years. "Thank you for donating your time." Kyle smiled as he read the message. He'd spent his weekend installing a modular wheelchair ramp for an elderly woman whose stroke had left her dependent on others for mobility. The materials had cost him a week's worth of grocery money, but seeing Mrs. Patterson's joy when she rolled onto her porch had been worth every penny. This was how Kyle spent his time now, working his custodial job during the week, taking on small accessibility projects on weekends, and donating his expertise to families who couldn't afford professional modifications. He'd also become a regular speaker at support group meetings, sharing his hard-learned wisdom about the importance of honesty in family crisis situations. "The lie always makes things worse," He told new families struggling with brain injury diagnoses. I thought I was protecting my children by hiding their mother's condition, but I was actually stealing their chance to grieve, to hope, and to love her as she was. Truth is harder, but it's the only foundation that can support real healing. His monthly supervised visits with Joshua and Robin had evolved from awkward encounters to genuine conversations. The boys, now 12 and growing rapidly, had begun to trust that their father wouldn't pressure them for forgiveness or burden them with his emotional needs. Instead, Kyle focused entirely on being present for whatever they wanted to share. "Daddy," Robin said during their November visit, "why do you clean our school at night instead of during the day?" Kyle considered his answer carefully. "Because I wanted to be part of your school environment without interfering with your daily life. You deserve to feel safe and comfortable at school without worrying about running into me in the hallways." Joshua studied his father with the penetrating gaze that reminded Kyle so much of Kathy. "Are you ashamed of being a janitor?" "No," Kyle replied honestly. "I'm proud of the work I do. Every classroom I clean helps you and your classmates learn better. It's good, honest work that serves a real purpose." "But you used to design buildings," Robin pointed out. "I did. And maybe someday I'll be able to do that again if I earn back people's trust. But for now, this is where I belong. I'm learning to serve instead of just taking credit." These conversations were small victories, moments when Kyle could demonstrate the man he was becoming rather than defend the man he'd been. Dr. Santos had helped him understand that healing relationships required consistent presence over time, not dramatic gestures or eloquent apologies. The real test of Kyle's transformation came on a cold Tuesday evening in December, when Emma called him with news that made his blood freeze. "Kyle, Robin is having emergency surgery tomorrow morning," she said without preamble. "His appendix has ruptured and there are complications. I thought you should know." Kyle's hands shook as he gripped the phone. "Which hospital? What can I do? Should I—" "Kyle," Emma interrupted gently, "you can't be there. The restraining order is still in effect, and Kathy isn't ready to see you. But I thought you had the right to know that your son is in danger." That night, Kyle sat in the parking lot of Riverside Medical Center in his battered pickup truck, keeping vigil outside the hospital where his son was fighting for his life. He couldn't go inside, couldn't hold Robin's hand, or comfort him through the fear. All he could do was pray and wait, demonstrating his love through presence, even when that presence went unnoticed and unacknowledged. He stayed there for 36 hours, leaving only to use the gas station restroom across the street. He slept in his truck, ate vending machine snacks, and waited for news that came in sparse updates from Emma. Robin's surgery had been successful, but he'd developed an infection. He was stable, but would need several days of hospitalization and weeks of recovery. On the second night, Dr. Jennifer Ross approached Kyle's truck. Kathy's therapist had been working late and spotted him through the hospital windows. "Mr. Barrett, I'm Dr. Ross. I've been counseling your wife, your ex-wife." Kyle rolled down his window, exhausted and disheveled. "How is Robin?" "He's going to be fine. But I have to ask, what are you doing out here?" Kyle's voice was hoarse from 2 days of worry. "I couldn't be with him, but I couldn't not be here either. I know I don't have the right to see him, but I needed to be as close as possible in case he needed me." Dr. Ross studied him carefully. She'd heard Kathy's version of Kyle's story, the lies, the betrayal, the systematic deception that had traumatized their family. But this man, sitting in a cold parking lot for 2 days, maintaining a vigil he would receive no credit for, didn't match the selfish manipulator she'd expected. "Does anyone know you're here?" "Emma knows. I'm not trying to violate any court orders or force contact. I needed to be here." Dr. Ross nodded slowly. "I'll let Ms. Acton know you were here. Whether or not she wants to hear it is up to her." 3 months later, another test arrived when Joshua qualified for the state science fair with his project on sustainable energy solutions. Kyle learned about it through Linda Martinez, his visitation supervisor, who mentioned it during one of their monthly meetings. "Congratulations," she said. "You must be very proud." Kyle was proud, desperately so, but he also knew he wouldn't be able to attend the competition. The science fair was being held at Joshua's school, where Kyle's presence as anything other than a night custodian would violate the careful boundaries he'd established. On the day of the competition, Kyle finished his custodial duties early and positioned himself outside the school gymnasium, where he could see through the windows but remain invisible to the families inside. For 3 hours, he watched as Joshua presented his project to judges, answered questions with confidence and intelligence, and eventually accepted a first-place ribbon. Kyle felt his heart swell with pride and break with longing simultaneously. Joshua had become an extraordinary young man, thoughtful, intelligent, principled, in ways that put Kyle's own character to shame. And Kyle had missed it all through his own choices. He was preparing to leave when he saw Joshua break away from the celebration inside and approach the window where Kyle stood. For a moment, father and son looked at each other through the glass. One inside, the warm circle of family and achievement, one outside in the cold darkness of consequences earned. Joshua raised his ribbon slightly, showing it to his father through the window. Kyle smiled and gave him a small thumbs up, his eyes filling with tears of pride and regret. Joshua nodded once, then returned to the celebration inside, where Emma and Kathy were waiting to congratulate him. Dr. Ross mentioned both incidents to Kathy during their next session. He sat in the hospital parking lot for 2 days when Robin was sick, she reported, and he watched Joshua's science fair through the school windows rather than risk making anyone uncomfortable by coming inside. Kathy listened with conflicted emotions. The anger that had sustained her for so long was slowly being complicated by something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that Kyle's transformation might be genuine. "He's not asking for anything," Dr. Ross continued. "No credit, no recognition, no expanded visitation. He's just being there in whatever way he can without causing disruption." That evening, Kathy sat with the boys at dinner in Emma's kitchen, wrestling with questions she'd been avoiding for months. "Mama," Robin said suddenly, "why can't Daddy come to my birthday party next month?" Kathy paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Because, sweetheart, Daddy made some choices that hurt our family, and there are legal rules about when he can see you." "But he's been good for a whole year," Joshua pointed out. "He hasn't tried to trick us or lie to us anymore, and he seems different." "Different how?" Kathy asked, genuinely curious about her children's perspective. Joshua considered his words carefully. "He doesn't make excuses anymore. When we ask him hard questions about what he did, he just tells the truth, even when the truth makes him look bad. And he doesn't try to make us feel sorry for him," Robin added. "He asks about us and listens to our answers. He doesn't talk about how sad he is or how much he misses living with us." Kathy felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the armor of anger she'd worn for so long. Her children were describing a man she'd never known Kyle to be, humble, selfless, focused on others' needs rather than his own emotional comfort. "Do you want Daddy to come to your birthday party?" she asked Robin. Robin nodded eagerly. "And to my school play, and to Joshua's graduation ceremony. We know he hurt you, Mama, but he's our daddy, and we miss having him at our important things." That night, Kathy called Dr. Ross. "I think I need to consider whether my anger is helping my children heal or keeping them stuck," she said. "What makes you say that?" "Because they're describing a man who spent a year proving he's changed, and I'm still responding to the man he was before. The boys need to see that people can grow, that mistakes don't have to be permanent, that families can heal even from terrible wounds. It was the first time since waking from her coma that Kathy had spoken about Kyle with anything other than rage or disappointment. It was the beginning of something new, not reconciliation necessarily, but the possibility that redemption, earnestly pursued over time, might be worthy of consideration. Kyle's year of humble service was slowly bearing fruit, though he wouldn't know it for months to come. The man who had once chosen convenience over character was learning that true love required patience, sacrifice, and the willingness to serve without guarantee of reward. In his journal that night, Kyle wrote, "Joshua, won first place at the state science fair today. I watched through the window, proud and heartbroken in equal measure. Someday, if I'm very fortunate and work very hard, I might earn the right to be in the room when he achieves his dreams. Until then, I'll keep proving that I can put his happiness above my own needs." The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation was solid. Kyle Barrett was slowly earning back the right to call himself a father, one humble act of service at a time. Chapter 8. The Ultimate Sacrifice. 2 years had passed since the wedding catastrophe that shattered Kyle Barrett's carefully constructed lies. In that time, he had methodically rebuilt his life on a foundation of humility and service, but nothing could have prepared him for the phone call that came on a rainy March evening. "Kyle." Emma's voice was tight with worry. "I need to tell you something about Kathy, and I need you to listen without interrupting." Kyle set down his dinner, a simple meal of rice and beans that had become his standard fare since most of his income went to court-ordered payments, and gave Emma his full attention. It was the first time she'd called him directly in months. "She's been having complications from her brain injury," Emma continued. "Severe headaches, vision problems, cognitive issues that are getting worse. Dr. Chen says there's a procedure that could help, experimental neurosurgery to relieve pressure and restore function. But insurance won't cover it because it's still in clinical trials." Kyle's blood ran cold. "How much?" $250,000, plus recovery costs, rehabilitation, lost income. "We're looking at over 300,000 total." The number hit Kyle like a physical blow. Emma was a successful surgeon, but even she didn't have that kind of cash readily available. Kyle did the math quickly in his head. His savings account held exactly $1,147, the result of 2 years of living on the absolute minimum while paying child support, medical bills, and court fees. "What can I do?" Kyle asked, though he already knew the answer would be nothing. He had no legal right to make medical decisions for Kathy, no financial resources that could make a meaningful difference. "Nothing," Emma said, confirming his fears. "I'm applying for medical grants, setting up a GoFundMe, reaching out to her old colleagues. But Kyle, if we can't raise the money in time..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Kyle understood. Without the surgery, Kathy could suffer permanent cognitive decline, seizures, or worse. The woman who had fought her way back from a 3-year coma could lose everything she'd regained. That night, Kyle sat at his card table with a yellow legal pad, making calculations that seemed impossible. His truck was worth maybe $8,000. His tools might bring another $2,000. He had a small life insurance policy he could cash out for its surrender value, about $1,500. Combined with his savings, he could raise perhaps $12,000. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. Over the next 3 days, Kyle liquidated everything he owned. The truck went to a used car dealer for $7,500. Less than its blue book value, but Kyle needed cash immediately. His professional tools, accumulated over years of architectural work and construction, sold to various contractors. For $1,800, he cashed out his meager retirement account, paying heavy penalties that reduced its value to just over $3,000. His furniture, electronics, even his clothes beyond the absolute necessities, Everything found its way to pawn shops, online marketplaces, and donation centers. Kyle kept one change of work clothes, one set of casual wear, his therapy notebooks, and the single photo of Joshua and Robin. By Friday evening, Kyle had raised $14,347, a sum that would have seemed substantial before his fall from grace, but now felt pitifully inadequate against Kathy's medical needs. As Kyle prepared to transfer his meager contribution to Emma's fundraising account, his phone rang with a call that would change everything. The caller ID showed Riverside Financial Services. Mr. Barrett, this is Janet Walsh from Riverside Financial. I'm calling about the Catherine Barrett Medical Trust that you established in 2019. We've received notification of your ex-wife's upcoming surgery, and I wanted to confirm the fund disbursement. Kyle's mind went blank. I'm sorry, what trust? The medical trust fund you established when Mrs. Barrett was first admitted to Greenwood Care Center. You set up automatic monthly deposits of $4,000 to ensure adequate funding for any experimental treatments or long-term care needs. The memory hit Kyle like a lightning bolt. In the chaotic weeks after Kathy's accident, overwhelmed by guilt and desperate to ensure she received the best possible care, he had indeed set up a substantial trust fund. His architectural practice had been thriving then, and he'd been earning nearly $200,000 annually. The financial advisor had recommended setting aside money for potential future medical needs that insurance might not cover. Kyle had been so devastated by the accident that he'd automated everything and tried to forget about the painful reminders of Kathy's condition. "How much is in the account?" Kyle asked, his voice barely a whisper. "With your monthly contributions of $4,000 over the past 4 years, plus compound interest and investment growth, the current balance is $247,292. Shall I authorize the full disbursement for Mrs. Barrett's surgery?" Kyle sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the cosmic irony. The man he'd been before his lies and deception, the Kyle who had loved Kathy enough to sacrifice financially for her care, even when she couldn't acknowledge his devotion, had reached across 4 years to save the woman he'd nearly destroyed through his cowardice. "Yes," Kyle said, tears streaming down his face. "Authorize the full amount, whatever she needs. I should mention, Mr. Barrett, that according to your original instructions, this disbursement will be made anonymously. You specified that any medical payments should be made without identifying you as the source." Kyle closed his eyes, remembering his younger self's wisdom in planning for exactly this scenario. Even then, he'd understood that Kathy's medical care should never be contingent on gratitude or recognition. "That's correct," Kyle confirmed. "Keep it anonymous." 2 hours later, Emma called back, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. "Kyle, something incredible has happened. An anonymous donor has paid for Kathy's entire surgery. The hospital received a wire transfer for the full amount, plus additional funds for recovery costs. We have no idea who would have done this." Kyle listened to Emma's joy and relief, feeling a complex mixture of gratitude and profound sadness. The responsible, loving husband he'd been before everything went wrong had indeed saved Kathy's life. But the man he'd become through his betrayal would receive no credit, no recognition, no pathway back into her heart. "That's wonderful," Kyle said simply. "She deserves every chance at a full recovery." "Kyle," Emma said, her voice softer now, "I know this isn't your doing. You don't have this kind of money. But I wanted you to know that whoever made this donation, they saved her life. And I wanted you to know that she's going to be okay." Over. The next week, as Kathy underwent the complex neurosurgery that would hopefully restore her full cognitive function, Kyle continued his quiet routine. He took the bus to work, now that he'd sold his truck, left early for the 2-hour commute, and returned exhausted to his empty apartment. He told no one about the trust fund, made no effort to claim credit for saving Kathy's life. The surgery was successful beyond Dr. Chen's most optimistic projections. Kathy's cognitive function improved dramatically, her headaches disappeared, and her vision problems resolved completely. But for Kyle, the emotional impact was even more significant. During Kathy's recovery, she asked to see the documentation of the anonymous donation. The hospital's financial office showed her the wire transfer records, which listed only Medical Trust Fund, C. Barrett, as the source. C. Barrett, Kathy said to Emma as they studied the paperwork. My maiden name is Acton. This was from Kyle's trust fund, wasn't it? Emma called the financial institution and, after much persistence, learned the truth about the medical trust that Kyle had established years before his betrayal. He set this up right after your accident, Emma told Kathy during one of their conversations. In the recovery room. $4,000 a month for 4 years, even while he was lying about everything else, even while he was building his new life in Millbrook, the automatic deposits continued. Kathy stared at the financial records with conflicted emotions. He planned for everything, she said quietly. Brain injury rehabilitation, experimental treatments, long-term care costs. He set aside money he could have used for anything else, and dedicated it entirely to my well-being. How does that make you feel? Dr. Ross asked during their next therapy session. Confused, Kathy admitted. Because it means that before he became the man who lied and deceived us, he was a man who loved me enough to sacrifice for my care, even if I never woke up to thank him for it. The Kyle who set up that fund, that's the man I fell in love with. 2 weeks into her recovery, Joshua and Robin visited their mother in the hospital. They had learned about their father's inadvertent role in funding her surgery, and their perspective on Kyle's transformation had evolved significantly. Mama, Joshua said, his voice carrying the gravity of a 12-year-old who'd been forced to mature too quickly. Daddy has been working as a janitor for 2 years to pay for your medical bills and our support. He sold everything he owned, trying to help pay for your surgery, even though he didn't know he'd already saved your life years ago. Robin nodded emphatically. And he never told anyone about the money fund. He could have gotten credit for saving you, but he didn't even remember. He'd done it. Doesn't that mean he's the kind of person who does good things without expecting rewards? Kathy looked at her children, wise beyond their years, forgiving in ways that put adult grudges to shame, and realized they were right. The Kyle who had established that trust fund had been a man of integrity and foresight. The Kyle who'd forgotten about it entirely while selling his possessions to help raise money for her surgery was a man who'd learned humility and selflessness. Do you want Daddy to be part of our family again? She asked them. We want you to be happy, Mama, Joshua replied, but we also want our family to be whole, and we think Daddy has learned how to be the kind of man who can make that happen. Robin climbed onto the hospital bed beside her. Mama, Daddy sits in parking lots when we're sick because he can't be with us, but can't bear to be away. He watches our school events through windows. He's been good for 2 whole years, not because anyone was watching, but because he wanted to become worthy of loving us again. That evening, Kathy asked Emma to call Kyle. For the first time in 2 years, she wanted to speak to the man who had been her husband, her betrayer, and ultimately, her salvation. Tell him I'm ready to try supervised family therapy, she said. Not because I've forgiven him completely, but because I think he's finally become someone worth the effort of forgiveness. The call came while Kyle was washing dishes in his tiny kitchen sink, the one chore that filled his empty evenings. When Emma told him that Kathy wanted to begin family therapy, Kyle had to sit down on his fold-out couch to process the magnitude of what was being offered. She knows about the trust fund, Emma continued. She knows that the man who set it up was the same man who betrayed her, and that the man who forgot about it entirely while trying to sell everything to help her is the man he's become. She's not ready to reconcile Kyle, but she's ready to see if the Kyle who loved her enough to plan for her care is the same Kyle who spent 2 years proving he can put her needs ahead of his own comfort. Kyle hung up the phone and sat in the darkness of his apartment, overwhelmed by the second chance he'd never expected to receive. The ultimate sacrifice hadn't been the money. It had been Kyle's willingness to transform himself completely, to prove through years of humble service that love could be deeper than selfishness, stronger than pride, and more enduring than even the worst betrayal. The path to redemption was far from complete, but for the first time since that terrible wedding day, it led somewhere worth going. The man who had planned for Kathy's care before he knew he'd need to, and the man who'd forgotten that planning while sacrificing everything to help her, were finally becoming the same person. It was the beginning of the hardest conversation of Kyle's life, but also the most hopeful. True character, he was learning, wasn't about grand gestures or perfect choices. It was about the consistency of small daily decisions to put love ahead of convenience, truth ahead of comfort, and service ahead of recognition. Chapter 9. Testing True Character. 3 years after the wedding that exposed his lies, Kyle Barrett knelt on the roof of Riverside Elementary School, installing ventilation equipment as part of a district safety upgrade. Now 13, the boys had begun to trust Kyle again through his years of consistent, humble effort. Their supervised visits had evolved into genuine conversations, and Kathy had recently agreed to family therapy sessions, a breakthrough that represented hope. Kyle had almost given up expecting. Kyle checked his watch, 10:47 a.m. The boys would be in their respective classrooms, Joshua in 7th grade, Robin in 6th grade. Kyle had made it his business to know their schedules, not to intrude, but to feel connected to their world in the small ways still available to him. He was tightening a bolt when he smelled smoke. Looking down through the skylight, Kyle saw gray wisps drifting through the hallway below. His construction experience had taught him to recognize different types of fires, and this one was moving fast. He grabbed his radio and called the job foreman. "Jim, we've got smoke in the building. Looks like it's coming from the electrical room. Copy that. I'm calling 911 and pulling the alarm." The fire alarm's piercing wail filled the air. Kyle watched through the skylight as teachers began evacuating their classrooms with practiced efficiency. But what he saw next made his stomach drop. A section of the hallway where the smoke was thickest remained occupied. Mrs. Henderson's special needs classroom, where 6 children with various disabilities required extra assistance to evacuate. Kyle could see Mrs. Henderson trying to help her students, but she was moving too slowly. The smoke was getting thicker, and Kyle's construction knowledge told him that if this was an electrical fire, the situation could deteriorate rapidly. He looked toward the fire escape route the other workers were taking. Then he looked back at the classroom where 6 vulnerable children were still struggling to evacuate. There was no choice to make. Kyle had spent 3 years learning to put others' needs before his own comfort. Today, that lesson would be tested with his life. Kyle grabbed the emergency crowbar from his tool belt and smashed through the skylight, dropping 12 feet onto the hallway floor below. The impact jarred his knees, but he rolled and came up. Running toward the classroom, the smoke made his eyes water and his lungs burn. Kyle pulled his work shirt up over his nose as he reached Mrs. Henderson's classroom. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm here to help." The teacher was trying to calm 3 children with autism who were overwhelmed by the noise and chaos. 2 other students, one in a wheelchair and another with cerebral palsy, needed physical assistance to move quickly. "Kyle?" Mrs. Henderson recognized him despite the smoke. "The fire escape is blocked. There's too much smoke in the main hallway." Kyle assessed the situation rapidly. The smoke was getting thicker by the minute, and he could hear ominous crackling that meant the fire was spreading. "We're going through." "My skylight," Kyle said, pointing up at the hole he'd created. "I'm going to lift each child up, and you help guide them out." Kyle grabbed a desk and dragged it under the skylight, then stacked chairs on top to create a makeshift ladder. "Sarah, you're first," he said to the smallest child, a girl with Down syndrome who was crying from fear. Kyle lifted her gently onto the desk, then hoisted her up toward the skylight opening. Mrs. Henderson climbed up behind them, helping to guide Sarah through the opening where other construction workers were waiting to pull her to safety. One by one, Kyle lifted the children: Marcus, who was blind and terrified; Jenny, whose cerebral palsy made her movements unpredictable; David, whose autism had him covering his ears and rocking; Tommy, who was in a wheelchair and required Kyle to carry him completely; and finally Amy, who was having an asthma attack triggered by the smoke. By the time Kyle lifted the last child, the smoke was so thick he could barely see. His lungs felt like they were on fire, and his vision was starting to tunnel. As he pulled himself toward the skylight opening, a section of ceiling tile collapsed, showering him with burning debris. Kyle felt searing pain across his back and shoulders, but he kept climbing. The construction workers above were shouting encouragement, reaching down to help pull him through the opening. Just as their hands clasped his wrists, Kyle heard a voice that made his heart stop. "Daddy!" Through the chaos, he saw Joshua and Robin on the playground below, having been evacuated with their classes. They were staring up at the roof, where their father was being pulled from a burning building, their faces masks of terror and disbelief. "The kids," Kyle gasped as the workers pulled him onto the roof. "Are all the kids safe?" "Everyone's out," one of the firefighters assured him. "You got them all!" Kyle collapsed onto the roof, his body finally giving in to the smoke inhalation and burns. As the world faded around him, his last coherent thought was relief that Joshua and Robin were safe, that all the children were safe. He woke up 3 days later in the burn unit of Riverside Medical Center, his body wrapped in bandages and connected to machines that monitored his vital signs. The room was dim, and for a moment Kyle thought he was alone. Then he heard a familiar voice reading softly. "The best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them." Kathy read from a volume of Hemingway quotes. Kyle turned his head slightly, wincing at the pain from the burns on his neck and shoulders. Kathy sat in a chair beside his bed, the same chair where he had spent countless hours reading to her during her coma. "Hey," Kyle whispered, his voice hoarse from smoke. Inhalation. Kathy looked up from the book, tears in her eyes. "Hey yourself, hero." "The kids. All safe," Kathy assured him quickly. "Mrs. Henderson said you saved 6 children's lives. The fire department said without your actions, they wouldn't have been able to evacuate in time." Kyle closed his eyes, overwhelmed with relief. "I couldn't let anything happen to them." "Kyle," Kathy said softly, "you nearly died. The doctor said your lung damage was severe and you have second-degree burns over 15% of your body." "But I wasn't," Kyle replied simply. "And neither were they." Kathy studied his face, seeing no trace of self-pity or desire for recognition, just genuine relief that the children were safe. "The boys have been here every day. They've been so scared. They told me something I think you should hear." Kyle waited, his heart hammering weakly in his chest. "They said that watching you risk your life for other people's children proves something they'd been trying to tell me for months. That you've become the kind of man who puts others' safety above his own, who acts on love instead of just talking about it." Kyle felt tears sting his damaged eyes. "Kathy, I don't need credit for—" "Stop," she interrupted gently. "For 3 years, you've done everything right. You've been humble when you had every reason to be proud of your transformation. You've served without recognition, sacrificed without expectation of reward. You've proven that the man I fell in love with 15 years ago is still in there. Not the man who betrayed us, but the man who loved us enough to grow from that betrayal." She reached for his bandaged hand, touching his fingers with infinite care. "Joshua and Robin asked me something yesterday, and I think they're right. They said, Daddy spent 3 years proving every day that he loves us more than himself. Maybe it's time to let him prove he can love you right too. Kyle's tears flowed freely now. 3 years of grief and hope and desperate love, finally finding release. Kathy, I don't deserve another chance. Nobody deserves anything. Kathy said firmly, but some people earn things, and Kyle, you've earned the right to try again, not because you saved those children, though that was incredibly brave, but because you've spent 3 years becoming the kind of man who would save those children without thinking about the cost to himself. Over the next few weeks, as Kyle recovered from his injuries, a new pattern emerged. Kathy visited daily, bringing the boys with her and staying for hours at a time. They talked about everything: his therapy progress, her recovery from brain surgery, the boys' achievements and struggles, their shared fears about trying to rebuild a family that had been so badly broken. I'm not the same woman who married you 15 years ago, Kathy told him during one of these conversations. And you're not the same man who betrayed me 3 years ago. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can build something better than what we had before. What does that look like? Kyle asked. Honest, Kathy replied without hesitation. It looks like truth even when truth is difficult. It looks like choosing each other every day, not just when it's convenient. On the day Kyle was discharged from the hospital, Joshua and Robin surprised him with a card they'd made together. The front showed a drawing of a man on a roof, pulling children to safety. Inside, in their careful 13-year-old handwriting, they'd written, "Thank you for showing us what real love looks like. It doesn't just say it cares, it proves it." Kyle held the card with hands that would always bear faint scars from the fire, reading their words over and over. He had spent 3 years learning that love wasn't about possession or convenience. It was about service, sacrifice, and the daily choice to put someone else's well-being above your own comfort. The man, who had once chosen deception over difficulty, had literally walked through fire to save children who weren't even his own. In doing so, he had proven to himself, to his family, and to the world that his transformation was complete. The hardest test of Kyle Barrett's character had been passed. What remained was the even more challenging work of learning to live as the man he had fought so hard to become. Chapter 10. Hearts Rebuilt Through Fire. 4 years after the wedding that exposed his lies, Kyle Barrett stood before his bathroom mirror, fingers trembling as he fastened each button of the crisp white shirt Emma had chosen with him. His reflection revealed a man reborn, not just by the silver scars threading across his shoulders like delicate lightning, but by the quiet dignity that radiated from eyes that had learned to see clearly through smoke and flame. Today, Kathy would marry him again. The journey to this moment had been carved from granite and grace. 18 months of therapy had rebuilt their foundation stone by stone. Supervised conversations that became family dinners, tentative trust that bloomed into genuine dating. They had courted each other like strangers learning love's true language. Honesty without armor, vulnerability without fear. "I need you to understand," Kathy had told him during their first real conversation as potential partners. "Forgiveness isn't amnesia. I remember every lie, but I also see every day you've chosen truth since then. I need you to remember," Kyle had replied, "so you can catch me if I ever start falling back into the man who hurt you." Their boys, Joshua and Robin, now 14, and wise as old souls, had become the architects of their parents' reunion, insisting on family meetings where they voiced their hopes and boundaries with startling clarity. "We want you together," Joshua had declared, "but only if you're building something beautiful, not just fixing something broken." The proposal had emerged naturally during an ordinary Tuesday evening, Kyle watching Kathy laugh at Robin's attempt to explain quantum physics, while Joshua rolled his eyes affectionately. Love struck him like lightning, not the desperate passion of youth, but the profound recognition of home. "Would you marry me again?" he'd asked simply. "Why?" she'd challenged. "Because you're my true north," he'd answered. "And I want to spend whatever time I have left proving I can navigate by your light." Now Kyle stood in Riverside County Courthouse, where justice had once sentenced him and would today bless his redemption. The setting was deliberately humble, just family and Dr. Ross, whose witness had guided them through the wilderness of healing. Joshua and Robin entered first, tall and serious in their first real suits, carrying themselves like young men who understood that love was both fragile and fierce. Emma followed in navy silk, her smile soft with the satisfaction of family restored. Then Kathy appeared, and Kyle's world narrowed to the space between heartbeats. She wore cream silk that whispered as she moved, her auburn hair catching courthouse, light like captured fire. At 35, she was magnificent, not despite the scars of survival, but because of them. Her eyes held depth that only storm-tested souls could fathom. "Hello," she said, taking his hands. "Hello, beautiful," he whispered back. Judge Rodriguez, who had once catalogued Kyle's failures, now spoke of redemption with the authority of someone who had witnessed transformation. "We gather to witness not just a marriage, but a miracle. Love that died and was reborn. Trust that shattered and was rebuilt stronger than before." Kyle's vows flowed like water over stone. "Kathy, I promise to love you with transparency as clear as window glass, with courage that chooses truth over comfort. I will never again ask you to be anything but exactly who you are, and I will spend every day becoming worthy of who you choose to be." Kathy's response made even the bailiff wipe his eyes. "Kyle, 4 years ago, I woke to discover I'd been erased. Today, I choose the man who spent years writing me back into existence, not with words, but with a life lived in service to love. I promise to trust you with my heart again, not because you're perfect, but because you've earned the right to be human beside me." Their rings were simple gold, untainted by history, carrying only the promise of a future built on bedrock truth. When Judge Rodriguez pronounced them married, Kyle kissed his wife with the reverence of a man who knew exactly what miracles felt like. The celebration at Emma's house was pure joy, intimate and perfect, filled with laughter that had been earned through tears. Joshua offered a toast that revealed the poet hidden in his mathematician's heart. "To parents who taught us that love isn't a feeling, it's a choice you make every morning, especially when it's hard." Robin followed with words that made everyone laugh through their tears. "To Mama and Daddy, thank you for showing us that happily ever after isn't the end of the story, it's just where the real adventure begins." That evening, in their modest 3-bedroom home, designed with accessibility and hope, Kyle and Kathy sat together on the couch they'd chosen as partners, not as people trying to recreate what was lost. "Any regrets?" Kyle asked, their fingers intertwined. "Only that it took us so long to understand what love actually means," Kathy replied, then smiled. "Are you scared?" "Terrified," Kyle admitted. "But not of you, not of us, of my own capacity for selfishness, of forgetting how much damage thoughtless choices can do." Kathy turned to face him fully. "That fear, that's exactly why I'm not afraid anymore. The Kyle who betrayed us would never have admitted he was capable of causing harm. This Kyle, the one who's terrified of repeating his mistakes, he's the one I trust with my heart." 6 months later, their marriage had settled into rhythms of deliberate gratitude. Kyle's architectural firm specialized in creating accessible spaces, work that fed his soul while supporting their family. Kathy had returned to pediatric nursing, her own experience with medical trauma making her uniquely gifted at helping families navigate crisis. They attended therapy not because they were struggling, but because they'd learned that love required Maintenance as intentional as any other precious thing. On their first anniversary, they returned to the courthouse steps where Kyle had once sat in defeat. This time, they brought flowers, not for the dead, but for new life, growing from composted pain. "What are you thinking?" Kathy asked as Kyle stood where his old life had ended. "I'm grateful to that broken man," Kyle said. "If he hadn't lost everything, we never would have found this." Kathy took his hand, studying the silver scars that decorated his wedding ring finger. "He wasn't a different person, Kyle. He was you, doing the best he could with the tools he had. The growth was just becoming who you were meant to be all along." As they walked to their car, Kyle marveled at the distance they'd traveled, from deception to truth, from selfishness to service, from broken family to something stronger than what they'd originally built. That evening, as they watched their sons help each other with homework, Kathy made an announcement that filled Kyle with wonder and holy terror in equal measure. "I've been thinking about expanding our family," she said quietly. Kyle looked at her, understanding immediately. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I want to create new life with the man you've become," she replied. "I'm sure Joshua and Robin deserve to see love that builds instead of just repairs. And I'm sure any child we bring into this world will know from day one what it means to be loved honestly." Kyle felt tears blur his vision as he considered the magnitude of trust she was offering to create life together. To trust him with a child who would never know the man he'd been before fire refined him into someone worthy of such faith. Their hearts had been rebuilt, not in spite of the flames they'd walked through, but because of them. Fire had burned away everything false, leaving only love in its truest form, not the easy emotion of early romance, but the daily choice to serve each other's highest good. 6 months later, their marriage had settled into rhythms of deliberate gratitude. Kyle's architectural firm specialized in creating accessible spaces, work that fed his soul while supporting their family. Kathy had returned to pediatric nursing, her own experience with medical trauma making her uniquely gifted at helping families navigate crisis. They attended therapy not because they were struggling, but because they'd learned that love required maintenance as intentional as any other precious thing. On their first anniversary, they returned to the courthouse steps where Kyle had once sat in defeat. This time, they brought flowers, not for the dead, but for new life growing from composted pain. "What are you thinking?" Kathy asked, as Kyle stood where his old life had ended. "I'm grateful to that broken man," Kyle said. "If he hadn't lost everything, we never would have found this." Kathy took his hand, studying the silver scars that decorated his wedding ring finger. "He wasn't a different person, Kyle. He was you, doing the best he could with the tools he had. The growth was just becoming who you were meant to be all along." As they walked to their car, Kyle marveled at the distance they'd traveled, from deception to truth, from selfishness to service, from broken family to something stronger than what they'd originally built. That evening, as they watched their sons help each other with homework, Kathy made an announcement that filled Kyle with wonder and holy terror in equal measure. "I've been thinking about expanding our family," she said quietly. Kyle looked at her, understanding immediately. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I want to create new life with the man you've become," she replied. "I'm sure Joshua and Robin deserve to see love that builds instead of just repairs. And I'm sure any child we bring into this world will know from day one what it means to be loved honestly." Kyle felt tears blur his vision as he considered the magnitude of trust she was offering. To create life together, to trust him with a child who would never know the man he'd been before fire refined him into someone worthy of such faith. Their hearts had been rebuilt, not in spite of the flames they'd walked through, but because of them. Fire had burned away everything false, leaving only love in its truest form, not the easy emotion of early romance, but the daily choice to serve each other's highest good. As Kyle held his wife's hand and watched their children's easy affection, he understood they'd accomplished something rare. They'd transformed betrayal into wisdom, failure into strength, the ruins of a broken family into a foundation that could bear any weight.